My name is Chris Bieneman, and I'm here with Kit Barton. Today we're going to talk about contributing to LLVM. Kind of at a high level, we have a couple different topics we're going to talk about. We're going to start by talking about who can get involved and how to get involved in contributing to LLVM. We're also going to talk about getting set up with some of the basics of the tools that you need to make code contributions to LLVM and Clang. And we're going to talk through the actual process of making code contributions with a demo, including uploading patches and going through the whole workflow. We're also going to talk a bit about the code review process, and we're going to talk through a little bit of Bugzilla, LLVM's bug tracking system. And at the end, we have some useful links that we'll share with you guys, and we're going to talk a little bit about developer workflows scattered around throughout, and we will take all of your questions, hopefully, as we go. So if you have questions, please try to make yourselves visible, raise your hands and wave. The lights are pretty bright, so it can be a little tricky for us to make you out. So try and make yourselves visible, and we'll get to any questions that you guys have. So the starting thing is, like, who can get involved in LLVM? And the basic answer is anyone. So the reality is, like, people who are contributing to LLVM already are coming from a diverse background. We don't all have backgrounds in compilers. I've never taken a course in compilers. I work with people who don't have college degrees. I work with people who don't have degrees in computer science. And there's really ways in which anyone who's interested in the community can get involved, and that ranges from contributions to the compiler in terms of code, or just other ways that you can get involved that we're going to talk a little bit about in terms of, like, non-technical contributions, or even, I wouldn't say non-technical, but we have immense need for infrastructure and for project management facilities that are things that people can get involved with even if they're not quite comfortable diving in and writing some gnarly C++ templates. So I guess then the question is, what does getting involved really mean? And one thing that I think we need to talk about is, like, the LLVM community is much larger than just a set of developers. It's much larger than a set of technical code that sits in a repository somewhere. Users of the community also participate. So what I mean by that is, like, if you use Clang, you are part of our community. Whether you participate or not, like, you are a user that we care about at some level. And so you can contribute to LLVM by filing bugs. You can contribute to LLVM by participating in discussions on mailing lists or on IRC that help direct the development in the directions that are important to you. University students are a great example of ways that people contribute, because university students use LLVM in their research, they use LLVM in their day-to-day projects, and as a result, they contribute back to the community and bring exposure. They bring research and new ideas into the community. Another big thing is that a large percentage of LLVM's technical contributions are coming from companies, big companies. You may have noticed on the intro slide, I work for Apple, Kit works for IBM. Like, we're here because this is what we do. And so it's also important that we have contributions coming from people from all sorts of different backgrounds in all sorts of different places. So how do you get involved? So starting off, many people get involved through their jobs. We also have participation in the Google Summer of Code and Season of Docs, which are great ways for people who are not entirely sure where to start to come in and get a mentor and start working on the project. We also, and I'll kind of go through this a little later on, we have bugs marked in our bug tracking system as things that someone in the community thought would be a useful place to start. They're simple bugs, should be digestible and easy to get into. You can also get involved by just participating in our conversations or using our project. And lastly, code reviews. So even if you don't necessarily contribute code reviewing is really valuable. And it's something that often the bottleneck to getting patches into LLVM is having people reviewing them. So now let's talk a little bit about how do the technicals work. So we have minimum system requirements for building LLVM and for making code changes to LLVM. So these include CMake version 3.4.3, You have to have a C++ 14 compiler. There's a whole bunch of versions spewed up there. You'll notice that most of these aren't actually fairly new compilers. So we have pretty old SAS software as our minimum supported versions. It should be pretty easy for anyone to get set up with this. We also, and this is kind of a recommendation, but if you're on Linux or a BSD-based operating system, you probably want to install either the Gold or LLD linkers. And the reason for that is because LLVM's debug information when you do a debug build is massive. And the I see some nodding. So the LLD and Gold linkers are much more efficient about their memory usage and the way that they handle debug information. So you will definitely appreciate not using the Linux default linker. There are also additional dependencies that will vary based on your host system and your options that you used. And I'm not going to go through all of those because there can be a lot of them. We also have kind of a set of common tools that many people in the community use. So Ninja is really popular as the build tool. It's basically, you can think of it as a modern implementation of a Makefile-like build system. It's a really simple but really efficient build system. Arcanist is a command line interface tool. We're going to demo some workflows with both Ninja and Arcanist that go through how to upload code patches to our review site. And Clang format is a really important one too. So we do have style guidelines for formatting source code in LLVM, and Clang format is a really great way to ensure that all of your patches are already conforming to the style guidelines so that people, when reviewing your patches, don't spend time focusing on style. They can focus on the substance of the patch. Additionally, depending on your workflow and what systems you're using, there's a bunch of other tools that are kind of nice to have. So Ccache and sccache are object file caching tools that can dramatically speed up your build times. ClangD is a Clang language server implementation that has editor support for a whole variety of editors, and it's really great. Clang Tidy is another coding convention enforcer. I will note that the LLVM codebase is neither 100% clean for Clang format or Clang Tidy. So we'll talk a little bit about how to use those tools effectively. And if you make changes to our documentation, we have Sphinx and Doxygen as our documentation building tools. Have I lost anyone yet? I know this is a bunch. One of the things that happened literally today is that we have moved to GitHub. And so we have a new and, in theory, streamlined way to get set up and making contributions where you can clone one Git repository and you have all of it. The other thing that you may want to do if you clone the repository is there's a subdirectory, Clang Tools, Clang format, that you may want to add to your path, because that will give you the Git Clang format tool, which is a great way to format your patches because it will actually format just the code that you changed as opposed to formatting the entire file. As I mentioned, we're not fully format clean, so it's good to kind of get rid of the spurious changes that might be unrelated to your patch. In configuring and building LLVM, it's pretty straightforward. It follows a traditional CMake flow where you create a build directory that you want to generate your build in, you run CMake, and then you run whichever generator you chose to actually build. This is a really simple build command for building LLVM and Clang in a release configuration with debug information generated and just including the x86 target. There are lots and lots of CMake options that we have that do all sorts of crazy things in the LLVM build system. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but here's a set of things that I think are probably interesting to some people in this room. And hopefully I'm not too far off base on what's interesting. But I think being able to build the documentation is interesting. So the first option, just turn it on and it'll actually include the Sphinx documentation generation. The second one here is really important if you're doing debug builds. So TableGen is a tool that during the LLVM build process, we build TableGen, which then gets used to generate source files that are then included and compiled later. TableGen can be really, really slow to run if you are on a debug build, and using an optimized TableGen can save you a lot of time on your iterative development flow. The other really great option here is enabling the sanitizer libraries. So sanitizers are a great way to find bugs in your code, and you can find them when you run the tests without having to wait until some user finds the bug for you 6 months down the road. If you're lucky, 6 months down the road. As I mentioned before, you may want to use a different linker than the system linker, and so the LLVM use linker option is how you would specify if you wanted to use LLD or Gold or the BFD default linker. The next option here only works if you're using Ninja, but it's a great option if you are in memory-constrained systems where you can actually specify how many link jobs you want to allow the build system to run at the same time. This is also really important if you decide that you dislike yourself enough to try to run an LTO build, where your memory usage will go through the roof, and you probably only want to run one at a time. The next option that I have here is the compiler launcher option, which is how you instruct CMake to use a tool like distcc or ccache or sccache for caching object files or distributed builds. And the last option down here, which I'm going to add with a caveat that it doesn't fully work, but we're working on it, so please don't necessarily go run off and use it right now, but we're going to get to it, is the LLVM use split dwarf option. So this is a great option for, or will be a great option on Linux when what it does is it allows us to have the linking phase skip linking the debug information, and so you end up with a much lower memory overhead in your linking phase. And with that, I am going to hand off to Kit.
Thank you. So are there any questions up to now? OK, so for the next little while, we're going to spend some time talking about Fabricator and patches themselves and how we will go about posting patches and getting them reviewed. So the workflow that we have, so this I guess one thing I'll start with is this workflow applies for Clang, LLVM, basically any of the projects that are in the LLVM umbrella, LLD, LLDB. They all follow the similar process. So we use a tool called Fabricator for code reviews. And Fabricators, I think it's fundamentally different from the way GitHub works with pull requests. So I'd like to go through those differences just for people who are more familiar with GitHub. So with GitHub, you have a repository, and the developers would typically create a branch and make a change and then issue a pull request for the moderator of the repository and basically say, here, I made a change. It's in my branch. I'd like you to pull my branch in. And then that code gets reviewed somehow, and ultimately the moderator or the maintainer of the repository will pull that code into their repository. Fabricator works a little bit differently. Fabricator works on the concept of patches. So as a developer, you create a patch. How you get that patch is entirely up to you. There's various ways of generating them, and we'll look at a couple ways in the demo. But you generate a patch. You post it on Fabricator. You essentially request a review by subscribing reviewers to that patch. You give it a description, what your intention is, that sort of thing. And then you go through the review process on Fabricator. The reviewers will give you comments. You address the comments. You upload a refreshed patch. And that kind of iterates until one or more of the reviewers approves it. And that's usually done with an LGTM, or looks good to me, at which point the patch is ready to be committed. And either you commit it if you have commit access to the repository, or typically you would ask one of the reviewers or somebody else to commit it on your behalf. And people are certainly more than willing to do that. But that's kind of the process that we go through to get code or test cases or changes in the documentation upstream. There's a few exceptions to that rule. For instance, if you're posting something that doesn't really need review. So if you're like, when we go to upload these slides, for instance, they're going to be uploaded into Git. We're not going to ask for a review on the slides. We're just going to commit them. But by and large, anytime you're making a change or an addition to the source, to a test case, to the documentation, you need to get it reviewed. Okay. Are there any questions about that process? Okay. So, as I said, there's two different ways to work with Fabricator. One of them is to upload patches manually. So I'm just going to walk through a little bit of this here, and then we'll try a demo in a little bit and see if we can get this done with a demo. But essentially what you need to do is you need to create a patch somehow. Typical ways to do this now that we're in Git is you'd be working on your own branch or your own local copy of the repository. You're going to make a bunch of changes. You can do a diff between your branch, your local copy, and the master, and that's going to give you a patch file. The request is, or the convention is to use this -u 999999, and what that does is that gives Fabricator and Differential a very large context with which it uses when it creates the actual patch or the differential review for people to review. And that makes the reviewer's job easier because then it's easier for them to look around the code around the changes that you've made, and if they're not like intimately familiar with what's going on there, they have some more context. So generally, you create your patches with this large context, and then you go to Fabricator, you manually create a review, you upload your patch, you add reviewers, and then it gets published. Emails get sent out to the LLVM commits list saying that there's been a new patch posted for review. The subscribers or people who you've listed as reviewers will get a separate email saying your review has been requested on this patch, and then it's there on Fabricator ready to go. Okay. I'm sorry. So the question is how do you know who to specify as a reviewer? That's a very good question. We're going to go through some of that in a little bit. I'm going to try it in the demo, but there's various tools. So git blame is one that's used frequently, so you look and see who's changed around those files. There's a code owners.txt file, which at a very high level will tell you owners of large components. So each backend will have a code owner. Major pieces of functionality in opt will also have a code owner. So the convention is typically you would at least request a review from the code owner, not just the code owner because they don't scale that well. But the convention is that the code owners will be included as well as people who've touched that file or that location recently. So these are just screenshots of the different pages that you go through in Fabricator when you go to create a review. So we're going to go through this again with the demo in a bit. The second way to upload patches is this tool that Chris mentioned called Arcanist. And Arcanist is a command line tool that basically will do all of this stuff for you. It will create the patch, upload it, create the review. It's very, very handy. When I discovered it a little while ago, I've only been using it to the point where I actually had to go back and remember how to create a review manually because I haven't done it for so long. So it does require a little bit of setup. There's documentation on our website on how to download it and install it. The setup doesn't take very long. It's only a few minutes. You do need PHP installed, but you basically download it and put it on your machine, and then you've got this arc command that you can use that has various different subcommands in it that you can use to create diffs, to refresh patches. There is an arc land. I have never been able to successfully get it to work for me. I don't know if the intention is, now that we've moved to GitHub, whether the intention is to make it work. And I don't know. Hopefully that they will get that working, but I don't know if that will ultimately happen. So again, these are just the screenshots that you get with the ArcDiff command. You go through, it lets you specify what you want to have in the summary that's on Fabricator, and then it will go through and do all of this work for you and give you back a URL of the review that it posted. Okay, so ArcDiff, as I mentioned, ArcDiff is one of the tools that Arc provides. It's used to generate the differential and create the revision. It allows you, on the command line, you can specify who you want the reviewers to be. It's a comma-separated list of the Fabricator IDs, which does require a little bit of manual work unless you have memorized people's Fabricator ID. It isn't always the same as their what shows up in Git and in the commits. So you do sometimes need to go and look up people's fabricator IDs. You can also specify a CC list. So a CC list is basically on the reviews. These are people that you want to be aware that you're doing this, but you don't necessarily require a review from them. So a lot of times, when I'm posting patches, if I know that people are interested in it, they want to use it, or they want to kind of see how it's progressing, but they're not necessarily interested or qualified to review it, I'll add them as in the CC list so that they can kind of track on their own if they'd like the progress of those patches. And then there's two other subcommands or options to ArcDiff. One is -- only, and one is -- preview. Now these aren't documented particularly well, I don't think. Both of them, they will create something called a differential revision. So it will create something on the web page that basically shows what the differences are between what you've done and what master has, but it doesn't go and create a corresponding review. So it does some of the work, but not all of the work. There isn't anything similar to a dry run that you would get with some of these other tools where it's just going to spit out the commands that it would do, but really doesn't do anything. So the first time I used this, it kind of freaked me out because it actually went and created stuff and I wasn't expecting it. But the difference is it will create the differential so you can see, it will give you a URL, so you can see what the differences are, but it doesn't go in and finish the steps of creating the actual review. And Arc also has the ability to run various tests, the lint and unit tests. I don't believe that is set up, at least not for most of the projects that I've worked with. I've heard last night that it may be set up for some of the projects, but as far as I know, it's not set up for Clang or for LLVM. So if you see this, when it spits back some messages saying that it's running lint and or unit tests, I don't think it's actually running anything. It's just saying that it's doing it. Okay, are there any questions about that? I kind of blasted through that pretty quick. Okay, so again, this is a question, how to select reviewers. Codeowners.txt is something that we try to keep up to date. It only has a limited set of information in there. So like I said, each of the backends will have an owner, big pieces of functionality, the register allocator, instruction selection, inliner, those types of things will have code owners. But in a lot of cases, you're going to be making changes and it's not going to fall into one of those general big categories. So git blame is very useful for finding out who's been active in that file and active around the areas that you've been touching. Arc cover is another command. So if you're using Arc and Arcanist to do this, Arc cover will give you the same kind of thing that git blame does, except it actually isolates it down to the changes that you've made, as opposed to git blame, which is going to tell you for the entire file who's touched what lines. And if all else fails, you can ask on IRC. Yes?
I was just wondering who is qualified to give a review and approve.
That's a very good question. We've got a couple slides on that later on.
Okay.
The short answer to that, we're going to elaborate on that more. The short answer to that is anybody is qualified to give a review. I personally don't think that anyone is qualified to give an approval, but I think anybody should feel free to give a review. And we'll go through that a little bit more detail later on. Okay. Are there other questions? Okay. Now, the fun begins. So we're going to try to do a demo, and we'll see how this goes. So can everybody read that? Ish. I need to change my key map. Okay. Is that better? Okay. So I want to do a couple things. Going through this process, Chris and I found some problems in the documentation. So I've got two patches here, one of which we're going to try to post, review, and commit live. The other one we're not going to, we'll post, And then it's because it's a little bit more elaborate, I'd actually like to get some reviews from other people as well. So we're not going to try to do both reviews live. So the first one that I want to do is, I'm going to just show you. It's a very simple change in the documentation. I needed to build the documentation. So I guess we didn't really talk about this, but one of the expectations is when you're creating patches that you test them before you post them for review. I think that's fairly straightforward. So we've got lots of test infrastructure to test code review, to test changes in the source for LLVM and Clang. Testing the documentation is a little bit different. You need to go through and you actually need to build the documentation. So I didn't have Sphinx set up on my laptop, which is what you use to build the documentation. So I needed to get that set up, and in the process of reading our docs on how to set it up, I found that one of the links is broken. Sphinx has gone and changed some of their web pages. So I'd like to fix this broken link in our documentation. And to do that, this is the patch that I'm going to use to demonstrate how you go through manually uploading it to Fabricator. So I've got the patch here. I've got a long version of the patch, which is basically created with the, I should have a long. Okay. I should have a long version here that I don't seem to have, that I should have created with the -u999 command. But it's not there. So I'm going to upload it with the process here. So first of all, here's going to be a quick tour of Fabricator. So when you go to Fabricator, reviews.llvm.org, this is the page that you're going to see. In the center here are all of the reviews that I've been added to do reviews for. So these are all the people who've requested that I review their patches. And then down here, it's got some of the work that is waiting on authors, and it usually has some of the stuff that I've got posted that is in various states, but it doesn't seem to have that. So when you go to create a review, you go to this left hand under favorites, and you go to something called differential. And then up in the top right corner, there's a create diff button, and that brings you to this. And this is where you go and you choose the file that you want to upload. Fabricator Clang format patch. Oh, I'm sorry, I was confused. Okay, the Fabricator Clang long format. So this is the other patch that I actually want people to review and have comments on. Sorry, I got confused. So this isn't fixing a broken link. This is talking about the tool that Chris mentioned, which is called Git Clang format. So we have written a script that allows you to format just your patches using Clang format prior to uploading them. And we have this tool described in one of our web pages, which is the Getting Started guide, but we don't have it described on the Fabricator page, which talks about how you go through the process of uploading to Fabricator. So I've put up this review that basically adds that description into the Fabricator page as well. And this is, because it's a little bit lengthier, I would like this to be reviewed by other people so that they can comment on whether it flows nicely with the rest of the documentation and makes sense. So that's what this patch is. I apologize for confusing them. So the first thing you do is you choose the file that you want to upload, and you choose the repository that you're going to upload it to. And if you want, you can cut and paste the raw diff in here, but I've never done that. And then you go down to this button here called Create Diff. And here you have the option to create a new revision, which in this case we do want to do. If you were refreshing a patch that already existed, you could go down here and pick one of the patches that you own, or sorry, one of the reviews that you own, and it would update the patch for that specific review. But in this case, we were going to create a new revision. And then we get into, you have to fill in a title, the summary. So this is to add discussion. And then so you give a summary. This is a fairly terse summary. Generally, you provide as much information as you can in the summary because it helps the reviewers, give them context in terms of what you're doing and why you're trying to do it. In this case, I've looked previously, and I know that James Knight, J.Y. Knight, and David, I think it's David Lure. I have it written down. Sorry, Dan Liu, have changed the fabricator pages. So they were the two that did most of the updates in this fabricator document on our docs website. So I'm going to ask them for the review on this. And at this point, this is all you need to do. And you can, oh, sorry. You should subscribe LLVM commits. I believe we've changed it to auto-subscribe LLVM commits to this, but it's not a bad idea to do this explicitly when you're creating the review. Okay? And what? I'm sorry? Oh, yes, sorry, yes. Yep. Good. Thank you. Okay? And then at this point, you can create the revision. And it's going to open up, give you a link to the review. So James and Dan will have got an email saying that I posted a patch and asked them for a review. And they can go in and review it. And here's the patch right here. You'll see these buttons here that show more context, show all 36 lines. These are here because I did that long version of the diff. So that allows the website to show more context if they want more context. So now they can actually go in and read the entire page from beginning to end if they want, as opposed to just reading the little section that I'm proposing to add. Okay? So then I wait until I get feedback from them, and they'll either send me comments, and I will need to make changes and then upload a new patch, or they will approve it, at which point I can commit it. Okay? Are there any questions? Yes? What were the choices of repository? That's a good question. What were the choices of repository? I usually just type in LLVM and it selects the one that I'm interested in. So there's LLVM and Clang. I don't know what other ones there are.
So this is actually all changed officially today. so sorry for any confusion about this. As of today, since everything is now under one repository, the repository should be, it's the LLVM mono repo repository is where all of the okay. Changes should go against. So, that is literally today. Sorry if it's a little confusing.
Sorry. I'm sorry?
No. So,
sorry, what was the,
so the question here was, does that mean no more fabricator? Oh. And so this is actually a good question. So with the move to GitHub, we've really only moved we've moved really two things. One is we've moved the actual source hosting over, and the main justification for that is previously the LLVM Foundation was paying for web hosting for our SVN repository, which actually is a lot of data traffic and becomes quite expensive. So by moving to GitHub, we're saving the foundation a whole lot of money by not hosting. We have not made any decisions about adopting other functionality from GitHub other than explicitly the web hosting. Now, we that may be a discussion. There's actually some roundtables this week or to talk about some options for considering pull requests and other workflows, but we have no plans to do that at the moment. The other thing that is actually being done off of LVM, off of GitHub is the commit emails. So there's mailing lists that get sent message every time a commit goes in, and those are coming from GitHub now as well. But that's the only changes for our infrastructure going on to GitHub.
So just a quick follow-up to that, and then I know we've got another question in the back. But since this talk is actually about contributing to LLVM, for those of you who have experience with GitHub and GitHub pull requests and or Fabricator and this process, if you have experience and feedback, participating in those discussions is extremely valuable. Because we do have a lot of people in the community that have a lot of experience with Fabricator, and getting a little bit more diversity and a little bit more opinions about GitHub and pull requests and that sort of thing is extremely valuable to us. So even if you've never committed anything, if you can share your experiences with GitHub and pull requests, it's very, very valuable.
Yeah, and to second that one, it took us 3 years from the moment we decided that we were going to move to GitHub to actually get to where we are today, where we've moved to GitHub. So anyone who has experience with GitHub that has opinions, that is really valuable for us because it will really help us with the next phase of whatever we do next as to how we handle infrastructure.
Yes?
So I had 2 quick questions. One was, you mentioned, is there automated builds for revisions? And the other is, I'm familiar with Fabricator, and there's other facets to it. Are you guys just using strictly the differential stuff, or any of that other, bells and whistles on it also?
So, okay, so two sides. So we do not have any pre-merge testing. We're not using any of those facilities in Fabricator. That is something that people have expressed interest in, but no one's actually ever made progress with it. That is one of the things that's been discussed about potentially moving to like a GitHub pull request workflow, is that pull request pre-merge testing is a very common flow. We're not there yet, and that's kind of the end of where that is right now. I think the other side of this is the other tools. So some of them get used and some of them don't. And it really kind of varies. I think for the most part, most people only use the Fabricator differential review tool. We do have Herald. So some people use Herald, which is a tool for auto-subscribing to reviews, and Fabricator can host patches and a handful of other things that people occasionally use. But we don't really leverage the full suite of Fabricator's capabilities.
So my perspective to that is, I'm exactly what Chris said. I've got some Herald rules set up to automatically subscribe. If people have patches that have PowerPC files in them, for instance, then it will auto-subscribe me. But outside of that, I use Fabricator for reviews, and that's all. And it's largely because I don't really know what else Fabricator has to provide. So I fall into the category of I don't know what I don't know. And again, if people are familiar with it and would like to give some kind of information or tutorials about the different things that Fabricator can provide, I think that would be useful. Yeah. Because we are using it, and I don't think that's going to change any time soon. Yeah. So if you're familiar with it and it's got other things that you think would be useful, some kind of education about that would be very well received, I think.
Yep.
Maybe a comment on build infrastructure. I have currently a prototype set up to comment on patches that you upload to Fabricator. We enable it for a group of 5 people right now, just for testing. And if anybody's interested in this infrastructure, let me know. Because kunal@google.com. You can also, just after the talk, we can have a chat. Yeah.
Good. Cool. Yeah, it is worth noting that one of the things that the LLVM Foundation provides some assistance to the project on is public infrastructure, which includes some of the hosting of our BuildBot infrastructure. And it is something that is an evolving infrastructure that there's always room for improvement, and it is a great way for people to get involved if they want to help us make improvements to our infrastructure and our development process.
Okay, are there other questions? Okay, so let's move on. So I'm going to try to demo Arcanist now. And for Arcanist, we're going to use the patch that I previously told you about, which is fixing the broken link into the Sphinx documentation. So for this one, I almost always use branches in Git. So I'll create my own local branch, do the work on my own local branch, and then use Arcanist to basically create a diff for me and upload that to Fabricator. So I'm going to do that right now. And I already have the patch written, so I'm just going to use patch to apply it. If I can type. Okay, and then you can use git diff to see what the differences are. So commit. Okay, so now I've got the work that I want to upload in my own branch committed with a message. I can now use our cover to, it takes a little bit of time, but it basically will tell me who has changed the file or the files in this area. So again, it's Dan. So he's going to get 2 reviews from me. So then at this point, all you need to do is an arcdiff -- reviewers, and then and I'm going to add Chris as well, because I'm hoping Chris is going to review it and approve it in a minute. So we can try to commit it. So what Arcanist does is it opens up your default editor, and it lets you edit whatever message you would like to see posted on Fabricator. It also adds some additional information. So here it says, fix broken Sphinx link. This is going to be the title, the summary. I didn't have anything else in my Git log, so or my commit message, so the summary is blank. It does list the reviewers here, so that's actually going to be part of your commit message in Git, which is actually really, really handy. And it also tells you who your subscribers are. So this will, the information that Arcanist has appended to my commit message, it's all going to go into the commit when I finally push this patch upstream. And it's extremely useful to get this level of information when you're looking through the Git logs. You can see who did the patch, who reviewed the patch. And it will also, after we've created this, it's also going to amend a link to the Fabricator review in it. So then when you go to commit it, you can look through the logs and you can get a link back to the Fabricator review. Okay. I'm going to do a really bad thing and not put a summary in here, because I'm going to try to save a bit of time. And here you go. So what it's done is it's created the review. It's given you a link here. It's tell you what it's changed. And you can do a git log, and you'll actually see, so in my local version, it's created these tags, and it's also updated the differential revision, which is kind of cool. Okay, so now I'm going to ask Chris to come up and review this. But he needs to do it in his window. You're gonna,
Yeah.
Which one?
I think it's right over here.
Okay.
Cool. So, okay.
And I'm going, do you need to type?
Yes, I will need to type. I can get that. Okay. Weird Dvorak people. So you can actually see immediately once I pull up and it's on my account, it shows right here the review that he just posted. And I can click right in here, and I can scroll through and see there's the change. Now, I could and probably would, except that I really like Kit, be a little mean about the fact that his summary here is pretty lame.
Blank.
But I'm just going to actually say this looks good to me, because it is actually pretty obvious. And I will just accept that and hit submit. And now the review is done and ready to land.
Yep. So you'll see, so when I go click on this, it shows you as accepted here. So it's in the accepted state. And I can go back to my terminal, and now I need to do a QWERTY people. And then, so I go back to master, I do a git rebase of, so I'm basically going to pull this in to here, and then I can do a git status, and it's going to show me I'm ahead of one commit, so I can do a git push. Now I can do a git push. Somebody's changed it in the time that we were. And so it's now been pushed, and it is in master. There's head, master, origin. So this got pushed. And again, for those of you who are just starting out, you won't have the privileges to commit. You won't have commit access. So you would typically ask one of the people on your reviews to commit on your behalf. Okay? Are there any questions about this? Okay. Yes, sorry.
My question was, how often is tip or head broken? If I were to just clone master, after this talk.
Well, I didn't break it, if that's what you're worried about.
Well,
That's a really good question. And I think what I would say is way more often than any of us would like to admit. It breaks. It's funny. The easiest way to know whether or not master is broken is actually just log into the IRC channel and see how many build bots are screaming at you, because the build bots they hit the IRC channel like crazy. But on a practical level, what I would say is that it probably breaks at some point, at least a little bit every day. Someone does something. But we have a lot of build bots that chime in. People are very responsive about fixing their patches, and if they aren't, other people are very responsive about reverting their patches. So we have a really, really strong revert till green philosophy in the community, which we are really aggressive about reverting things. And for the most part, it doesn't actually impact us too badly that people don't have pre-merge testing.
So I just want to follow up, because there's something that we neglected to put in here that I want to make sure that we mention. The convention is once you've posted a patch, you don't commit a patch unless you're going to be free for the next little while. I usually try to give myself an hour or two to monitor both my email and the IRC channel. Don't commit your patch and go home for the day, or commit your patch and go away on vacation. That's generally considered bad etiquette. You want to commit it and then be around, because if for whatever reason you do break something, people don't get that upset as long as you're there to revert it. If you're not there to revert it, you tend to irritate people.
We do have some friendly shaming of people who commit at 4 o'clock on a Friday and break the world and walk away.
Yeah. So don't be one of them. Don't.
Yeah, we do generally have a pretty good attitude about things, though. It's all fixable, right?
Yeah, and by the same token, if you do break somebody's build or whatever, don't get upset if they revert your patch, because there's a lot of downstream users, there's a lot of people that are using this in their day-to-day business, and they need this to stay clean. So if you break something, oftentimes it's happened to me where I've broken something, and by the time I've actually logged in to try to address it, somebody else has reverted it. So don't take offense to people doing that, and people aren't going to get upset if things break every now and then. People understand. Yes.
Sorry. The question is, if you're dealing with multiple comments on the review and you have to spin out multiple patches, is there a way to automatically check that you're pushing the latest patch? The one that's been submitted instead of an older patch? Is there a way to automatically check that for you?
So depending on which approach you take, if you're using Fabricator manually and manually uploading the patches, you specify the file that you're going to upload, so you can always check to make sure you look at the file right before. If you're using Arcanist, Arcanist has a command called which, I believe, so you can say arc which, and it's going to tell you which review it's going to upload your patches to, what all it's going to include in the next upload. So if you do an ArcDiff again, it's going to try to re-upload a patch and try to associate it with an existing review, okay? And if I usually do an arc which before that, and it's going to spell out for me which revision it's going to link that to and all of the additional changes that it's going to include in there. So that's the tool that I usually use to find out, to make sure that I'm uploading exactly what I want to be uploading.
And so I'm not sure if an LLVM community uses this Jenkins or any similar continuous integration system to kind of avoid this kind of broken master problem.
So we do actually have a combination of Jenkins and BuildBot build fleets that run all the builds. That tells us when the master is broken. In terms of avoiding the master being broken, then we would need to look to something like a pre-merge testing, which we just at the moment don't have. And it's also worth noting, we do actually have a bunch of documentation on the website about how submissions work and how you can commit to LLVM. Not all patches are required to go through code review. And now, in theory, the patches that don't go through code review shouldn't be things that are going to break everything. So an example, actually, the link fix-up that Kit made earlier is actually the kind of patch that is a common sense, simple enough patch that could have gone in without code review. We don't encourage large patches without code review, but it does sometimes happen.
So regarding friendly shaming of brokenness,
I promise we don't actually shame people, please.
Right. So I naively assumed that the lack of pre-merge testing was like by design, the way the community wanted, not because no one's gotten around to it yet. I mean, it seems like we're in the steady state for a while here. So I assumed also that if you submit a broken patch that, you know, it's okay for it to break because there is no pre-merge testing. And there's believe me, there's millions of subtle bots out there that are testing configurations that you would
Yes.
never think to test. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be awesome if I could have run these
So I think
beforehand?
I think on a practical level, there's a couple things. So one is LLVM is widely used in so many configurations, and frankly, if you look at our build bots, some of the build bots take a ridiculously long amount of time to complete their builds. And so, as with any strategy, when you use pre-merge testing, you're never going to have fully exhaustive pre-merge testing. You can't, especially not with a project the size of LLVM. So a good example here is like one of the metrics that has always been used for compilers to figure out whether or not a compiler is completely broken is, can you use the compiler to build itself? So you take the compiler, you build a compiler using your host compiler. You take that compiler and then build the compiler again, and hopefully that second compiler actually works. And if you even want to go one step further, then you can take that second compiler and build the compiler a third time. And in theory, the second and third should be binary identical. Now, I say in theory because in practice, that doesn't always work out as cleanly as you might like. But the reality is, like, to do that kind of testing takes, you're talking, even on good hardware, with a fairly simple configuration, that's hours.
Right, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing, right?
Right, and so I think the gist of it is that historically we've been on SVN, and building up pre-merge testing on SVN is not always easy to enforce, and it's not always easy to build. And so I think now with our transition to GitHub, there's a lot more opportunity to build tooling, and there's actually a lot more tooling that's actually already built for Git. GitHub has all sorts of stuff built into it to allow pre-merge testing and to enable pre-merge testing. And I think we're going to have a whole bunch of conversations over the next year, 2, 3, 5, however long it takes us, to figure out what the direction of development should be.
Great.
Again, a very good place to contribute if you've got experience and knowledge there.
Looking forward to it.
So my question is about how do contributions work from within a company? So let's use Apple. Are they doing internal reviews and then someone's just wholesale merging things that don't get reviewed publicly?
No, so that depends. Okay,
Depend on the
so that depends how the companies internally do their development. Depends on the company. It depends on the group within the company, and whether they do internal code reviews or not is kind of their problem. From the community perspective, we don't allow companies to just drop large swaths of code and say, here you go. And there's actually a prime example of this happening literally right now. Apple just uploaded, just literally a couple days ago, an RFC with a series of patches for adding ARM64 pointer authentication support into the public Clang. And that is a totally new thing. It's a whole bunch of patches. It's a big amount of work. And there's going to be people in the LLVM community poring over those patches and deciding whether or not those patches are the way that the community wants the implementation to be for upstreaming. And that's generally the flow of how it works. There have been certainly some historical examples in the past that aren't that clean. But the general idea is that everything should be code reviewed by the community, not just by shoving things through.
Okay, so we got another question? Yeah.
Here we go.
Okay.
Another question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Your philosophy about a code review. So a code review could be anything from good to like booting up a interpreter in your brain and running the code. You mentioned that it's a bottleneck, but also that we're not doing pre-merge testing. So what are you expecting out of a code reviewer?
That's a good question. That's kind of where Kit's about to go.
Yeah, I skipped through some of the fabricator slides to make up a little bit of time. So we can touch briefly on code reviews. So in terms of who can do the code review, I firmly believe that anybody can do code reviews. I tend to think that there's 2 or 3 different varieties of code reviews. One is a fairly high-level review, making sure that it conforms to the coding guidelines, that it's documented well, that sort of thing. And anybody can do those. And then there's the next level of code review in terms of trying to understand the logic, the design, making sure it fits in with the way the infrastructure works. And for that, you need to have a lot more kind of familiarity with the parts of the compiler that the patch is touching. What my observation has been is a lot of times code reviews or patches go up there and they just kind of sit there. And a lot of times people going in and doing one of these very high-level reviews kind of pokes the other people to go in and also review it. So, going and just doing a cold review, we call them internally, just, picking something and adding your comments saying, this looks fine, or you missed this is spelled wrong, or whatever. Oftentimes, the people who need to review it to approve it, it'll pop up back on the top of their list, and they'll see it, and then they'll go and do the review. So I advocate that anybody can do these reviews. Although one of the things that I believe, I won't speak for Chris, but I believe is that if you don't feel confident in the area that the patch is, don't approve it. You can say, this looks fine to me, but I'm not an expert in this, and so it's better for somebody else to actually do the approval. We've had cases where people will just approve things and they don't quite really understand what's going on, and so we get bad code in that we need to go in and undo. But that's really at your discretion. So as a reviewer, I know it can be very intimidating. I've been in this experience, this place where you're new, you don't really know a lot about what's going on, but it honestly, the sooner you do it, the sooner you start. It will take a lot of time initially, but then it does get easier, it does get faster, and you learn an incredible amount about LLVM and about the infrastructure from doing the reviews and asking the questions through reviews, like why did you do this? Why did you use that data structure? You learn a lot from that experience, and you also help to move other people's kind of patches along. So
it's also worth noting that on the LLVM website, there's a bunch of documentation about like who can do code reviews, who can approve things, and how contributions work, and it's all incredibly vague. And it's actually intentionally vague, in part because we don't necessarily want to say that you can't review a patch until you've submitted 700 patches to some part of LLVM. Like, we really want to be able to encourage people to do things at their comfort level. If you're comfortable stepping in and providing feedback on a patch, we want it. If you're not comfortable, then let's figure out how we can get you comfortable, because we want the feedback.
Yeah. And then just briefly, a little bit about the etiquette for code reviews. So first and foremost, be respectful. And we certainly haven't had problems with this, so people shouldn't be scared about giving reviews or getting reviews. But we like to continually remind people, the people who are submitting patches come from various walks of life. They have various experiences, so be respectful. Not everybody knows about all of the intricacies of LLVM. But the flip side also applies to that. So if you've posted a patch and you've had comments from reviewers, make sure you address all of the reviewers' comments and make sure that they're comfortable with what you're doing. There's been cases where it gets approved, and so they just commit it, and they don't necessarily go through and address all of the reviewers' comments. And I mean, the reviewers have taken their time to provide feedback to you. I think that it's almost common courtesy to just make sure that you've addressed any of the concerns that they've got, and that everybody's happy with the state of the patch before you commit it. All right, and I think that's
the end of our time.
That's the end of our time.